Hey, morning. they making grants or anything? Or do they have just like competitive call for people?
Yeah, so that's sort of identifying email, identifying gaps, and then call for proposals.
Are you helping out anyway? Or?
Yeah, I've been to a couple of the meetings and I've given feedback on drafts.
Most of what they do is like health stats, right? Epidemiology.
Yep. Yeah, so it's not clear whether. So Alan and I have talked about I remember what's in the section that I was supposed to talk about.
That's what
I was like, I want a couple grapes, and then they were all attached. They didn't do a great job. I mean, I will probably. I would.
How's your
Sitting in the back here.
first book?
Better, way better than I expected.
That's great.
Yeah, it sold last 6 months ago.
Yeah.
The breakfast.
That's great. And it's big. So yeah, it's self-sales.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. Oh, experience.
You had a great roll-up too, right? All those
Yeah, that was fun. So had to get done all the work.
Yeah.
Showed up. Now it stays forever.
Yep. figure out like one part of that's important enough to I feel by a lot of it is I really have to be
Seriously?
sort
Wow, so you're gonna throw some
Inclusion art.
it's gotta be
Hey, matey.
I'm gonna let you
do
It's funny because I'm talking about pirates in my voice.
Is there one day that
Are you really?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. You can just make a comment
Yeah,
about
good.
how it's talk like a pirate. Maybe you're supposed to be a pirate.
Although you're not supposed to, I think on these things I'm supposed to like
so
not
try to
reference what
kind
it
of
is.
one thing.
Oh,
I do that.
so that's, yeah. Good point.
I can do it in the question and answer.
Right, sort of when things get started, for planning meetings, sometimes it's the launch as well. You gotta overhear different things. So,
And
and
PR.
then more than that,
It's
they
the
all
they that become the speaker. I don't know who the they is, but
so I do
apparently
believe I feel, and
they
I try to take the summer off
discovered
as
that
much as I can.
pirates were actually
Whenever
very progressive
fall tends to
and
be a little bit bigger.
oriented
I've tried to avoid doing weekend trip.
democracy on the pirates.
Actually, so the 88 movie,
They had
always
fun.
I used to go more.
Everybody
I decided not to go.
split
Like I'm not hiring people.
The booty.
Exactly.
You know, there are a lot.
No, there was an
She's
ethical way
there,
of doing that.
but everyone else is there.
And it was favored. And then they had special funds and injured.
I work with, I watch the college work on Tuesday.
All pirates like this, and how do you know that?
Tuesday.
And what made you think to look into it? That's hilarious. Like the governance structure of a pirate ship.
Exactly, exactly. So,
I can't do it. Thursday, Friday. Tuesday.
Was the one did you do that?
I feel less bad about it, even if it doesn't.
Yeah, it's that thing. That's more of a projector.
Does your wife travel? Not as much. She doesn't talk sometimes, and she has some mistakes. She's actually been able to taking things like that. So it's like, so it's actually kind of fun because I get to go to Oregon and get out.
I have not been back. I guess I was there. Probably the last time I was there. So I think Amy's been heading out there more, like she's trying to find projects there. But get ready. Love Colorado, but I feel like I'm so right now maxing out on projects.
yeah.
right now, or we
I'm
go
revealing that I'm really old school. I have, it's what I like about this is they don't fall apart. They can take the nickel directly to a class and they survive.
and I have to slide.
Yeah.
Can't do a notebook without one.
And so they tear the sheets out, right? So whatever I write stays here. Now, I'm going to eventually go to tablet. So I will.
We're not eating, so
I'm
I
on
won't bump
that
anyone with
path.
my left elbow.
All my colleagues have some sort of pad. People laugh at me when I do this.
All right, good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Thank you for coming. My name is Greg Gershuni. I'm the Executive Director here at the Aspen Institute for the Energy and Environment Program. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out this morning and welcome you to our headquarters here in DC. Today's event is on our dialogue on energy governance. And so this was a dialogue where we brought together a group of experts ranging from academic experts to regulators to industry folks across several years of dialogue and conversation to come to the recommendations and results in the report here. And so we're really excited to kick this off. We've been doing a few roundtables in Colorado and Texas. We'll be doing a few more later this year in Ohio and Pennsylvania on the results of this. But this really feeds into the larger mission of the Energy and Environment Program, which is to bring people together to talk about difficult issues in the energy and environment space and to come up with solutions and ideas that we can then push out into the real world. And so for almost 50 years, we've been doing this first on environment and then on the energy crisis in the 70s, and more recently on climate change, the environmental crisis when it comes to water quality, water quantity in the West. We have dialogues with China and India on climate and clean energy, as well as our Aspen Energy Week and other forums that we put on throughout the year. So I'm really excited that we're kicking this off. And with that, I want to invite Evan Michelson up to give some remarks. Evan has been our partner on this for the last several years. He's the program director of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, where he runs the energy and environment portfolio. And so I'd like to welcome Evan. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everyone. So I'm really happy to be here, and I also want to sort of share my thanks on behalf of my counterpart, Mary Lou Hastings, who is the Vice President of Sustainability Programs at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, who couldn't be here today. But Mary Lou and I and our foundations, the Sloan Foundation and the Mitchell Foundation, really were partners from the very beginning in supporting this work and getting it started. So I'm really happy to be here for the launch of this report and for this discussion. One of the best parts of my job is seeing the results that come out of the work that we get to fund, and in working with fantastic grantees like the Energy Environment Program here at the Aspen Institute. So just to take a moment and give you a sense about why Mary Lou and I were interested in funding this project from the beginning, the thing that we were really interested in was in bringing together scholars and practitioners that were really interested in examining various issues related to shale resource governance. We are both very committed to bringing cutting-edge research to bear on these societally important questions, and I can say that the quality of the discussions and depth of thinking on these topics really exceeded both of our expectations. So we were really excited over the course of the project and to see the report come out today. So there are a number of reasons for that. One is the excellent work of Greg Gershuni and Maggie Carroll, who led the process in recent years and stewarded the conversations that resulted in the report that we're going to be discussing today. You know, I always think that good facilitation is both an art and a science, and the team here really brought those skills to bear to make the project a success. So the second reason for this success is the time and commitment that was provided by the dialogue participants, and as Greg said, and you'll hear more about, came from such a wide range of backgrounds and sectors, which was really made it quite interesting. And as I mentioned, I love to learn from people that are smarter than me, and the ability to spend a number of sessions over the course of a few years with people who are deeply knowledgeable about these issues was quite illuminating. And I can't thank them enough for their generosity of spirit and time and participation throughout the process. In particular, many thanks to Daniel, Kate, and Martha for not only being here today, but for being part of the core team that was involved in synthesizing the findings from these discussions, which was really quite a complex task of integrating various strands of thought into a cohesive whole. And one of the things I learned over the course of this process is that that's kind of the magic of what these Aspen dialogues bring to the table. They bring together people who are curious about a key topic area, who want to learn from one another, who are open-minded to consider alternative viewpoints, and then are committed to advancing evidence-based decision-making. And that fits in very squarely with our program at the Sloan Foundation that I run, which is focused on advancing understanding about the economic, environmental, and policy trade-offs related to a range of questions across the energy system. And I think the report that we're going to be discussing today is an excellent example of that. It shows what can happen when a group of really renowned thinkers and doers is given time and space to unpack a challenging problem and then work together to identify lessons learned and recommend new pathways forward. So Mary Lou and I are really excited about the report, and we hope that the findings and recommendations prove useful to a wide number of stakeholders. And while the participant groups' conversations may have ended, I think this is actually just the beginning of the dialogue's extended impact going forward, and I'm really excited to hear the discussion today. So thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to learning from the three panelists later on.
All right. First, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. You have their full bios in the leaflet that you got at the front, so I won't go too deep into their backgrounds. But first, Daniel Ramey is the Senior Research Associate at Resources for the Future, based in Michigan, not in DC. And then Martha Rudolph was the Director of Environmental Programs at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And Kate Konchnik is the Director of Climate and Energy Programs at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. And so Kate, I'm gonna go to you first. The way I've been thinking about this is kind of three different buckets, three separate but connected topics that we talked about through the dialogue series. And I want to start with stakeholder engagement. So can you talk about stakeholder engagement and kind of how you're thinking about this?
Sure. It is on. I was going to ask you if it's on, but then I answered my own question. Thanks, and thanks for coming this morning to talk about this with us. We've spent so long together talking about these issues that we assume everyone thinks they're as exciting as we do, so it's nice to get some validation on that. First, the framing, and the framing is really important because we spent a lot of time in this dialogue talking about the framing. You know, when we're talking about stakeholder engagement, in what context are we talking about it? It's not happening in a vacuum. And given that we had in our group a very diverse group of stakeholders, from operators to academics to community members to different regulators at different government levels, it was really important to kind of set that table. So we first talked about what was different now about oil and gas development and why so many different people from across these different stakeholder groups felt it was important to talk about governance. And we decided that it was the intensity and the scale of unconventional oil and gas production, that this felt different. If you lived near it, it was louder, had more energy, more input, so you had more truck traffic in your community. We also talked about the proximity to communities that hadn't seen this kind of activity before. So there were a lot of communities in the United States that it's a normal fact of life to have oil rigs or derricks in your backyard, from parts of California to Texas to Oklahoma. But we were now seeing this in upwards of 30 states, in lots of neighborhoods and communities that hadn't seen it before. And so there were a lot of questions and there were a lot of concerns about the potential environmental and just social day-to-day impacts that this might bring. We also talked about when you get into stakeholder engagement, what is the topic? And we made a distinction in our dialogue between whether development should happen or how development should happen. And we recognized, though there were very different views at the table about whether we should be developing, that that's happening, that we're operating within a legal construct, that by the time the local governments and most of the people in the community, except for maybe the royalty owners who've entered into leases, by the time they know development is happening, the leases are already signed and some of the permits have been issued. And so often that's the very first sort of point of tension between stakeholders, that the community feels really off guard, caught off guard. And so we talked about how you sort of get through that whether question, which has often already been answered, and how you get to the how development should unroll with all the stakeholders involved. At the end of the day, we sort of had this very broad statement of we think that it's important to create effective early engagement between actors and systems. There was sort of a timing element there and a substance element, and then I'll turn back to you. On the timing, we decided it's really important not to wait for the first problem, not to wait for someone to raise an alarm bell about smelling gas or having to sit behind such a large string of trucks in the morning that your kid's late to school every day. By the time, if that's the first time that a company that's producing in an area comes face to face with the community to respond to some problem, you're going to have this sort of deeply embedded mistrust at the get-go. And so we talked about the fact that it was really important as soon as a company, there were reasons why a company might quietly sign leases for a while, but that as soon as it made it public that it was going to be developing, that it was really important to have a proactive engagement strategy with stakeholders. And then another is substance. There's a risk management hierarchy by someone called Baruch Fischoff that I love, and I shared it in one of the dialogues, and several of the companies actually came to me afterwards and asked for this hierarchy. But the way the hierarchy begins is all we have to do for risk management or to make a community feel safe is get the numbers right. As long as our engineers are on it, we get the numbers right, we've done our job. The next is all we have to do is tell them the numbers. We'll have a community meeting, we'll tell them the numbers, we'll tell them it's fine, we'll go home, everything will be fine. What we've found in shale gas stakeholder engagement is that is not fine. The next level of the hierarchy is we'll explain to them what we mean by the numbers. So you start hearing about companies wanting to do education strategies. If only people understood this stuff a little bit more, they would be fine with it. And onward until the end of the hierarchy is you actually engage the community and other critical stakeholders, local regulators, state regulators, as partners. And you have to be willing to come to the table to change some things. There are some things you can't, as an operator, change, but where you can, it's really important to have that give and take with a community. There's a lot more to say here, but I'll stop now.
So, Martha, from your role at the Department of Public Health and Environment, how did you come into this? I guess come into the dialogue, but how did you view your role within the dialogue and within the broader ecosystem as a regulator?
Thank you. So in Colorado, most states, the environmental program and what I would call the downhole regulation of the extraction of shale gas as well as other natural resources is usually housed in the same department. In Colorado, it's different. There's the Department of Natural Resources where the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission resides, which is the regulators of the downhole, what I call downhole. And then there's the Department of Public Health and Environment, public health workers and experts, and then the environmental programs. So there's, I think, always a fair amount of of tension even within states regarding the regulation of shale gas extraction, natural resource, the resource extraction. Typically, the oil and gas regulators are charged with supporting the extraction, promoting the extraction. Things have changed a little bit in Colorado now, but that's typically what it is. And then the environmental side and the public health side are the ones that are looking at the risk and trying to manage that risk. And so my participation, I think, as a regulator, I think there's a recognition that it's the states that largely are the regulators of shale gas, oil and gas development. It's not really the federal government so much. Even on federal land, states have authority to regulate both the environmental requirements and certainly the downhole requirements. And so coming to this, I think looking at it more from a day-to-day, practical, pragmatic, how do we make this a better system overall in the regulatory processes that are on the books and then that are evolving because of the communities that are the stakeholders, there's a wide variety of different stakeholders that are involved in this. Communities are becoming a significant stakeholder and are more concerned as they see more knowledge. And as Kate said, where oil and gas operations come closer, shale gas in particular, into communities, they are more concerned. They're becoming more knowledgeable about the risks and the fact that we don't really know what the risks are and the impacts of the risks. And so regulators have a real, in my view, duty to figure out what's the best way to involve stakeholders in the process and the best way to manage the risk from a really pragmatic, on-the-ground regulatory view.
Daniel, from your perspective, doing research on this, the stakeholder engagement piece, what were the most, I guess, what were the critical interactions between stakeholders? What did you view as, I guess, the most interesting part during the dialogue discussion, but also kind of in your broader research?
Thanks, Greg. And I want to say first that thank you for organizing this and helping put it together, and to Evan and Mary Lou and Maggie. I can say, and I think this is shared across the people who participated in the dialogue, for me, participating in this exercise was one of the most intellectually rewarding things that I've done professionally. So thank you for that. One of the things that stood out to me during our conversations was the importance of recognizing that we're not going to achieve perfect outcomes from every stakeholder's perspective, that there are going to be trade-offs that each stakeholder, or whatever term you want to use, each person or group at the table is probably going to have to either make some sacrifices or come away from the engagement process somewhat unsatisfied. And I think when we put together the recommendations that are in this report, it's not a recipe for perfect outcomes from everyone's perspective. It's hopefully a recipe for a process that engages as many groups and individuals as possible and creates an environment where the best outcomes are possible rather than a perfect outcome. As I think, all of us who work on energy and environmental issues understand, there is no risk-free or impact-free type of energy development. There may be particular types of impacts from oil and gas that are different from the impacts that we see with building out large solar farms or wind farms or mining for nuclear energy, for uranium. I think there are good reasons to be particularly concerned about the impacts of oil and gas development, and we'll talk about those impacts more today in our conversation. But I think the thing that stood out to me is that we're not aiming for perfect outcomes from everyone's perspective, but instead setting a process in place that can lead to the best outcomes under conditions where, as Kate said, oil and gas development is actually happening in the world. So how do we manage it in a way that creates an environment for better outcomes?
And this is kind of a question for all three of you on the stakeholder engagement piece. Where were the critical missing links in terms of engagement that wasn't happening that needed to happen in your view that came up during the dialogue? Like, were there particular conversations that weren't happening, like, you know, you mentioned the trucks in development areas?
I'll take a stab at that. I think through a lot of the stories that people were sharing from their perspectives as operators or regulators, that a theme came out that stakeholder engagement was too often crisis management. So across a whole bunch of issue areas. So it was after a community gets super riled up and very upset about something, and then that first stakeholder engagement is an open mic town hall where everybody's screaming at each other. Now, there's a time and a place for everybody screaming at each other, and often if you can get past that stage, then you can start to do some real work. But a lot of times, for instance, one example we had as part of the dialogue, someone who was in the cabinet in Oklahoma when Oklahoma started experiencing seismic events. And at first, there was sort of mixed signals to the public about what the source of those events might be. So people were getting more and more agitated. This is a state that is quite familiar with oil and gas development, and yet, you know, I went to Oklahoma City, and the young woman driving the cab to get me from the airport to the hotel, first thing she wants to talk about is that there had been an earthquake the next day or the day before, and how scary that was. People were getting very agitated and felt like they weren't being told the truth about what was happening. So that by the time regulators and operators tried to get sort of ahead of this, it was too late. However, it then took some leadership from the state government to convene a coordinating council to get key stakeholders represented, scientists, regulators, operators, to start having a conversation, exchanging information. What are you seeing in your science? What are you seeing? Let's compare data. Let's figure out exactly what this is. So that then they started to be able to say, yes, we think this is from water disposal, from oil and gas activities. We think it's when it goes this deep into this base formation. And they started to explain the mechanics to people and figure out how to get ahead of it. And that completely changed the stakeholder engagement. They started using communities to sort of tell us when you feel this, because it helps us map better where the source was. So it was also bi-directional communication, not just talking at the community. So I think that was, you know, too often it's crisis management. Those singular times we see where you were able to transform that into something more proactive, it felt a lot more productive.
Martha, Danny?
So yeah, a couple of thoughts. I think regulators, again, so the state largely is the entity that regulates this. And they have their statutory mandate and their regulatory mandate on how they do it. And so I think part of the issue has been, well, this is how we, you know, operators have a right to extract the shale gas or the oil, and we just regulate it, and, you know, when they come to us, we issue them the permit, and then all of a sudden, when the communities are getting involved, it's like, how do we deal with that? The other, and I'll get to that, I'll come back to that in a minute, but the other issue is that states, regulators, I think in the past, I think this is changing a little bit, don't like to go to communities or go to stakeholders and say, we don't know. They want to have the right answer. And so they wait until they get the right answer, which then that also delays actually talking to people. I think we underestimate that when you go to a community and you say, here's what we know today, we're still figuring it out, we're trying to, you know, so be patient with us. That's much better than waiting until the tail end and then going to them and saying, well, we still don't really know, but it's too late now. So I think part of what the dialogue has taught all of us, and then just experience regulators have learned, is that you really need to start the conversation with all stakeholders very early on. Get them involved, as Kate said. Tell them, you know, what you know, when you know it, what you don't know, what you're trying to find out. Get them involved in the conversation. Let them be a part of it to the extent they can be. Tell them what they can do, what they can't do, all of that. But again, I think the key is to get the stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved early in the process, which historically has just not happened.
So I guess the main point I would make would build off of what Martha is saying, in that this is a really polarized topic, shale gas tight oil development. There are lots of strong advocates on the anti side, lots of strong advocates on the pro side, and they talk past each other all the time. They don't listen to each other. They often present present their views in ways that are whether intentional or not, like can be kind of misleading, right? They leave out context or whatever. And so doing these early engagement processes where the developer is at the table with the environmental NGO that's active in the region, we haven't seen a lot of that happening in the real world, and it would be hard to make that happen. But if you could make it happen, it would really be helpful to get names and faces and actual real lives behind some of those positions for people who are genuinely concerned about the environmental and health impacts of oil and gas development happening in their region, at the same table with someone who is concerned about the economic benefits and trying to employ more people in the community with oil and gas activities. And so having these dialogues as early and often as possible, in my mind, would be a way to at least reduce some of the kind of extreme rhetoric on both sides and some of the inflammatory issues that come up. So, when you do have earthquakes that start happening, you don't have people who are, adamantly saying, no, oil and gas has nothing to do with these earthquakes. That kind of response is really genuinely not helpful for anyone in the process. And there are analogs on the environmental advocate side as well. And so that's one of the key values that I see from these types of engagement activities.
So I want to turn to the research area, which is kind of the second bucket of the dialogue. Daniel, talk about the problems with getting a vast array of research done by governments, done by the private sector, done by academics, into the hands of the people who need it, and how is that best done? Talk about the recommendations from the report on that.
Yeah, it's a really challenging issue, and we don't have a good system to do it right now.
And I'll just add that it doesn't only apply to this area, but applies to all areas of research and science.
Absolutely. And so hopefully some of the lessons that come out of this can be applied to other areas of not only energy development, but other difficult policy topics that are, have complex scientific issues underpinning them. So the first thing to say is that good decisions require good information, and everyone at the table hopefully will have access to that good information. But when it comes to rapidly evolving technologies that are happening in new places under new contexts, it's hard to provide that information quickly. And so what you sometimes end up with is the situation that I described a moment ago, where you have people on either extremes of the position arguing from a place where they don't have really great information. And so they're making statements that might not be totally supported by the research and evidence that exists to date. Another challenge with this topic, getting good information to decision makers, is that just doing the science itself is hard. Quantifying the effects is hard. It takes a while to do it well. And that's an inherent limitation whenever we're dealing with, again, complex issues that involve doing real science. The third information challenge is that researchers, particularly in the academic sphere, are rarely incentivized to actually do research that has direct and timely implications for policy. So if you're on the tenure track at a university, you're not necessarily, it's not the top of your priority list to get good information to regulators who can actually use it on the ground. Your job is to publish in a high-rated journal so that your tenure process can go well. And that's a kind of structural challenge that exists. So what might we do about this problem? Well, we came to some conclusions about how we might try to address this. And the first thing that we could try to do would be to incentivize researchers to do work that is relevant for timely decision making. That requires resources. Big challenge. All of the things that I'm going to talk about now require resources, mostly money. And so I say that with all understanding of how difficult it can be to raise money for these efforts. So incentivize researchers is number one. Number two, develop mechanisms to actually synthesize the research that does come out from different researchers and put it into a format that is digestible and usable for regulators. I think Martha and the other regulators who were at the table in Aspen made it clear that they don't have time to read 40 academic studies that come to lots of different conclusions on a single topic. They don't have the resources to do that. And so we need a mechanism for somebody with credentials and someone without a big axe to grind on these issues is able to look at the body of evidence that's out there, synthesize it, evaluate how strong the evidence is, and then describe what the major findings are for policymakers in a way that's actually usable and actionable for them. So again, this requires resources. It's not an easy thing to do, but we basically know how to do it. And then the third issue with actually trying to get the information into policymakers' hands is to make them aware of it. So even if there are people out there synthesizing the literature, doing literature reviews, writing great things, if there's not outreach to the regulators and their staffs, then they're just not going to know that the information is out there. So again, this requires resources to do active engagement and trying to just get the information in front of regulators and develop some credibility with them so that they know who the researchers are, they know who to go to when they have questions about these complex topics. And the last thing I'll say about this is that there are a couple early models of this that are starting to develop. They're developing slowly. Just last week, there was a report issued by the Health Effects Institute, their energy division led by Donna Voorhees, who participated in the dialogue. And this was a 2-3 year process. They had a committee of experts that essentially reviewed the literature on the health impacts of oil and gas development. And they synthesized that research and they put it into a report. They made a variety of findings. They identified where the remaining gaps are, and I think they're aiming to support additional research to sort of fill those knowledge gaps in a way that will be useful for regulators and policymakers, as well as other groups, NGOs, industry groups. We hope everyone should be able to benefit from this information. The second example of trying to do something about this problem, and then I'll stop talking, is an effort that we've put together at RFF called the Shale Research Clearinghouse, or SHARC with a C, my favorite acronym. And essentially what we've tried to do is set up an online platform for people to easily access the full body of literature that exists on a range of topics, such as health effects or local economic effects. It's not all bad stuff, right? What's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff is what we want to know. And then we've also tried to, again, synthesize this research in short summaries that can be actionable for policymakers. So there are a couple models that are out there that I think are promising. The key challenge is finding resources to really build out that work and then get it into the hands of policymakers and others.
So Martha, there are all these researchers out there doing research so you can read it as a regulator. How do you, what was your best, what worked best for you to absorb as much of this research as possible and to come to conclusions that made sense for you, and what didn't work?
This is a really hard issue for regulators. So someone in my position, I have, I'm an inch deep and a mile wide in the subjects I have to cover: stormwater, drinking water, oil and gas, air quality, feedlots. I mean, radiation, rocky flats. All of this are, under my purview. Do I have time to read articles? No, I really don't. I have staff that are more subject matter experts, and I have asked them in the past, I mean, do you ever look at articles that come out? They do, but the issue for them is not imagine a great program. How can I improve my program? It's like, oh my God, my hair's on fire today. Is there anything that can help me make this decision faster? And typically there is not. So this is a real dilemma because the people in the regulators in the state really are they have too much to do and not enough time to really think about it, which I hate to say that, but I think that's really true. Some really spend the time trying to figure things out, but that's a luxury that most don't have. So we do rely on folks synthesizing, coming to us and saying this. You can't accept it on its face. You have to sort of think about it, and then you have to develop this trust with whoever is providing you this information. I mean, that's part of it too, is the trust piece of this, because there's always going to be somebody on the other side that's going to come back and say, well, that study's faulty because of X, and you don't have the ability to sort of parse that out and try to figure out what's real here. So this is a I've talked about this a lot. We talked about this last night. We've talked about it in other situations where you have sort of the community of researchers that are coming up with all these great things. And let's assume that what they're doing now is trying to come up with valuable research for the which is not always the case. It's like, great, assuming it is, but getting that to the policymakers and having the policymakers, okay, so now part of the issue for states as well is states have different views about extraction industry. Some states very much support fracking. Some states are even banning it. So when you're talking about where does the science come and where do the risks come, a lot of that, the overlay are the legislature and the governor and the policymakers there. So that's another layer that we have to be mindful of when we're making decisions based upon science and research. There's, the direction that we're asked to go can be influenced by other decision makers. So this is a really tricky issue, and I wish that we could figure out a way. Your clearinghouse, what you're talking about, I think if we could make that work, I think that would be very beneficial for states to really have that information, real-time information, to be able to use that in the decision making.
Kate, how do we also get this research into the hands of the public? Are there effective ways of taking all the research that regulators and government staff don't have the time to read and making it available in some way so that the general public or that landowners or the other stakeholders in this process can better understand what the most recent research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things I wanted to say about the dialogue that I appreciated so much was the inclusion of sociologists. I thought having that perspective was incredibly valuable, and I feel like if one of our sociologist friends were here, they could answer this even more effectively than I can, because it was really helpful to have that sounding board of, oh, this is the dynamic that happens, like, that we're describing in this stakeholder engagement. This is why it happened. Or if you really want to talk to people, these are the methods you might want to consider using. I think some of the conversation we've already had, you could build on for public digestion of these or consumption of these scientific research outcomes. For instance, the synthesis. I think, often people have a sense, whether it's climate change or unconventional oil and gas development risks, that there's 1,000 papers and they say whatever the funder wanted them to say, and they come to all these different conclusions. And how am I supposed to sort of wend my way through these? So having these sort of synthetic reports that say, hey, 10 papers are out right now on risks to groundwater from oil and gas development. These are the different outcomes. This is the range that we saw. This one seems like an outlier. The reasons for the differences are these assumptions. So you start to break down the studies and explain to people, where are they agreeing? So where are we starting to see consensus? Where do they diverge? Why do they diverge? And then you're giving people the tools without them having to read each of these 40-page papers that are often very dense and tiny print and are good for putting you to sleep and getting tenure. You give people the tools to say, well, okay, that assumption makes sense to me. That feels like what I saw in my community. That assumption doesn't make sense at all. So I'm going to weigh more heavily this paper. Like, it gives people that ability to use critical thinking. The more we can do that, the better. I also think, and I was happy Martha didn't bring this up, but a lot of the regulators brought up in you're being kind in our dialogues that they'd often get sort of blindsided by research. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it would turn out that somebody had done research that was directly relevant to work that Martha's doing in her jurisdiction. And the first time she hears of it is a gotcha phone call from a journalist. That then frames the debate for the public, right? They see a, hair on fire article, defensive regulator who's never heard of this before, and that's how people often are introduced to the topic. So working with people to give them a heads up ahead of time, working with journalists to make sure that there is some element of, truth in the article and how it's reported, and it can still be exciting, I think is all really important for public consumption.
So I want to turn to the last bucket, which is the regulatory excellence bucket. So Martha, talk about what that means, what the discussion was in the dialogue about regulatory excellence. We had a number of regulators as part of this dialogue.
Sure, happy to do that. So the third real recommendation or subject was regulatory excellence, and I think it's a logical continuation of the stakeholder engagement and the research that Daniel talked about. So as I indicated, states are the primary regulators of shale gas and oil development. States vary remarkably, actually, in how they treat it, with some states having, where development of shale gas fracking has gone on for decades within the state. Texas, Oklahoma, even Colorado, used to it, at least in most communities. And then you get states like New York and Pennsylvania, where it is a relatively new phenomenon. You have states that embrace it, states that reject it, communities within a state that normally would accept it that are unhappy with it, because we've talked about how with the advancement of technology in fracking and in horizontal drilling, these are now going closer into communities that are aware of the potential risks to them. And so you've got quite a variety of differences in policy perspectives between states, and even within, as I talked about before, within a state between different agencies and their missions. But even in those states where you have, where they support the extraction of shale gas, you are getting communities that are expressing concern about the risks to them and their families and their environment from shale gas going into their communities. So one of the findings, I want to read one of the findings from the report. Regulators must work with often sharply divided stakeholders to identify and solve problems that require not only technical competency, but also an understanding of the social, economic, and legal drivers in order to improve regulatory outcomes. So we talked about regulatory excellence, and what does that mean for the regulator? How can the regulator evolve to be more competent in what they do? Most regulators, when they're hired, you have a lot of scientists, you have a lot of engineers, sort of technical experts, but they don't have expertise in what I will call kind of the soft skills in dealing with communities, and how do you communicate with communities and with other stakeholders, the NGOs, the local governments, as well as the operators, to convince maybe the operators that they need to work more closely and more thoughtfully with those that are concerned about what they do. So another comment in the report about regulatory excellence. It's required to manage conflict with integrity, empathy, competence, impartiality, and a sense of accountability, right? You need to have all those sort of soft skills. I will argue that integrity has always been there, but it's the other skills that are sometimes difficult for the technical regulators to employ in dealing with all the stakeholders and the conflicts that the stakeholders bring to the table, that the regulators are tasked with sort of getting through that minefield and coming up with a solution that as Daniel said, not everybody's going to be happy, but maybe people, if you can do it correctly or doing it well, they can all understand how you got there and why you made the decision that you made. So part of the recommendations that, there's 3 recommendations that came up from this piece. One is the establishment of the community of practice. Community of practice would be where state regulators share information with each other, experience that they have, ask questions of each other. Those that are more knowledgeable help talk to those states that, or those regulators in other states that are less knowledgeable. So it's that internal sort of community that is developed. There is some of that already now with some organizations like the Environmental Council of States, which is, I call it the trade association, but it's basically the heads of state environmental departments. There's the IOGCC, which is the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, which is the counterpart for the agencies that regulate downhole operations. So those sort of structures do exist in a somewhat limited capacity. This is a recommendation that sort of has what I would think of as more of an umbrella organizational structure so that states can really learn from each other on all these issues in a particular forum. The second recommendation is for an academy. This is taking it one step further, where state regulators have a place to learn in a training way, where you have a curriculum that the regulators can come up with on what they need in order to learn not just technical issues, although that would be part of it, best practices from a technical perspective, but also some of these soft skills. How do you communicate with people effectively? How do you become a good listener and not argumentative? That kind of thing. And that would be an academy that is structured, again, just within the state regulatory system, so just state regulators. And then the third recommendation is then to possibly expand that, the academy, so that you're including other outside of state process. So you have potentially operators, maybe community members, NGOs, local governments, that they can all come in and learn through this academy. Again, a lot of it is just a communication piece. How do we communicate better with each other? How do we listen? How can we talk with each other? And the end result of this, the point of this is that the quality of regulation and performance of regulatory agencies would then continually improve. So this is a continuous improvement process. It's not like the one and done. You can come back to the academy, take extra courses, that kind of thing. So that's what this recommendation is.
Kate, talk about the regulatory excellence piece of this, and how do you view this from your perspective, and how did you see this conversation evolving over the course of the dialogue?
Yeah, this was a really interesting piece. We had a lot of regulators in the room, and as Martha said, some were more the environment and public health perspective, some were the production perspective, sort of natural resources, and some of them had both hats that they had to wear, depending on the structure of the state. I think there was I think people were differently placed. If I had to grossly generalize, and it's not just because Martha's up here, it felt like those with the environmental experience had a little bit more exposure to stakeholder engagement. It felt like some of the natural resources, the job is to give a permit to a producer as long as they show me all the documentation and check all the boxes. And we got from them sometimes in these conversations, which were, very dynamic. This isn't my job. This isn't my job to make sure the community is happy. That's like a whole other thing that I need to do. And in fact, it's a really hard other thing that you're asking me to do. So I'm going to go and stay up until midnight standing in a town hall and getting screamed at. Like, this is not what I signed up for. And so I think there was a lot of conversation about how to make this a little less scary, and the sort of, the earlier that you get involved and the sooner you're talking to communities, the better, and the less likely you sort of get that initial sort of shock of, wow, for 6 hours, people are telling me I don't know how to do my job. That's hard to take as a human being. And as we were kind of moving along, it seemed like there was more opening, even among participants. Of I could see where this could actually make a lot of sense to start earlier and speak to people. And so there was this really interesting conversation of, when do regulators know and when can they start to publicly talk about it with communities, given that often, operators are going and kind of signing up leases quietly. But there seemed to be more of that recognition of getting out there early, and that part of that early and active stakeholder engagement should be part of your job description. And if done well, never a perfect outcome. You probably will still get yelled at some point. But it actually can make your job easier. A little bit more work up front can make things easier down the pike.
And Daniel, with the diversity of regulators, from some new regulators that are always coming on board, to experienced regulators, to states that have resources to dedicate to this, to states that have very limited resources, what's the in the with a regulatory kind of thinking about this in the regulatory excellence, constant improvement, what are the things that you've seen that can help the newer regulators, the less experienced states in this area?
Yeah, I think some of the trade associations, of course, that Martha mentioned are quite helpful, and their role can be expanded to do even a better job of helping regulators, and also other enforcement officials who are in the agency to to do their jobs as well as they can. The other thing that I would point out here is Martha used the word impartiality. That's a really important word when it comes to the regulatory staff and the policymakers who are creating the policies that the regulators are enforcing. And the impartiality of regulators is often questioned. And one of the ways that I think we could address that issue would be better data on enforcement activities. From a research perspective, there are a lot of us who are very interested in the outcome of environmental enforcement, but there's not good data on environmental enforcement. Most state agencies do not provide a lot of data that you can actually use to evaluate the impartiality, if you want to think of it that way, or to evaluate the effort put forward by the regulator, or to evaluate the stringency of which the regulations are enforced. And so having better data provided by the regulatory agencies could enable some more accountability that the public and other stakeholders could use to try to encourage maybe a more rigorous enforcement regime, or maybe just a more balanced one. And obviously, politics plays a role here when we have appointed regulators, appointed by governors or state legislators. But hopefully, data provision can help hold those policymakers to account and hold the regulators to account as well. Again, not going to solve all the problems, but would enable a little bit more public engagement and engagement from NGOs on this issue.
I want to talk about the impartiality piece of this, because I want to clarify something about that. It's impartiality but it's also a recognition that the regulators are complying with the statute and regulations that they have to comply with. So, for example, in the air quality world, we get people that are wanting us to impose additional conditions on an entity that is emitting, an industry that's emitting some kind of pollution into the air. And we may not be able to do that because the law says as long as they do X, Y, and Z, they get a permit. So we don't have the flexibility of saying, well, but this community is really concerned about something, so you need to do more. So the impartiality is within the structure of the system. And I don't want people to confuse impartiality with sort of balancing everything and coming up with something that it still is under the system that is in place, the regulatory statutory system that's in place that provides the structure for the decision making that you can and must make.
Right. I mean, I guess I was thinking. So I wonder. I was thinking more along the lines of decisions within regulatory agencies
Yes.
about, what resources to devote to enforcing what different environmental statutes, right? So not the policymaking itself, but the, extent to which those policies and regulations are actually monitored and enforced on the ground.
Sure. Yep. I agree with that.
So I want to take a couple questions in just a moment from the audience, but I want to ask, towards the end of this dialogue, we also got into how we apply this into other areas. We talked about West Texas and the development of solar and wind, the development of transmission and pipelines. I mean, I guess this is more broadly applicable than to shale development. Can you talk a little bit about this and how you think about kind of where the other areas that this can be applied?
So I can start briefly, and I guess I would just make a really simple point. So sometimes when I talk to people about impacts of energy development, particularly negative impacts of energy development, and I say, wind also has an impact, solar also has an impact, they sometimes take it to mean that I'm saying they have the same impacts as oil and gas, and they certainly don't. When we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, oil and gas activities has a, enormously more important greenhouse gas emissions footprint than solar and wind. But that's not to say that solar and wind don't have any impacts. And so as we think about long-term carbon dioxide emissions reductions and greenhouse gas emissions reductions across the energy system, there are going to be new conflicts that emerge when it comes to transmission lines, when it comes to large wind farms. Those conflicts are already happening, and they are already impeding the development of, let's say, long distance transmission, or wind farms in some places, or solar farms in some places. And so the principles that we've developed here, I hope, can be useful to solve the community challenges that inevitably will arise when any new infrastructure, large scale infrastructure, is built in the United States. And that's not to, so I'm not equating wind with oil. They're very different, but we're going to see some of the same issues as that infrastructure gets built out.
So I would even take this even more broadly, because I think what this was designed to do is to be neutral, not to be in favor of extraction or against it, but to develop a process that can be followed to make the decision making less controversial, less confrontational, more balanced. And I think that this, what's recommended here, can have application across all sorts of areas, even outside the energy development sphere. This is where perhaps today we have most of the conflicts, but it's not the only place where we have conflicts. And so taking the information, what we were looking at for stakeholder participation in research, and then how can we improve regulators who are, how they, instead of just being the check the box and issue the permit kind of people, that are actually more involved in ensuring that there's at least trying to be more equitable in the process itself. I think it's got application far beyond just even the energy world.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of the other work that I do is in the electricity space, and I think there are some parallels here. And one of them is the fact that things have changed and more people are involved or want to be involved in the decision-making process. So just as those permitters are used to just working with the company over a series of weeks or months and getting the documents and signing away the permit, state utility commissions, we're used to just having the electric utility walk in, say, this is what we want, these are the costs we plan to spend, this is what we want to pass on to customers. They said yes or no. And in both of those venues now, you have lots of other people showing up to these hearings and wanting a voice. And so trying to figure out how to engage all those, and that's even before you get into states with a much more competitive electricity market, where now you've got, I with a solar array on my panel, on my roof, I'm now a generator too, and I want to be at the table, and someone might be aggregating my power with other homes and bidding it into a wholesale electricity market. So the players are different. And it's interesting looking at the stakeholder processes. And one quick thing, what we're learning is some of the stakeholder processes in the electricity markets, it can be death by stakeholder process. There can be too much stakeholder process where you need multiple full-time people on your staff to go to all the meetings for all the subcommittees, to be there when the decision is made. And that doesn't necessarily result in optimal outcomes either.
So I want to open up for questions. Phil? I think, do we have a microphone?
Two concerns. One is, first of all, I think this is terrific. I think you're probably making a real contribution here to various things. One quick suggestion, maybe this is happening already, but is instead of the regulator having to run a stakeholder process, you have another entity or agency or group who that is what they're professionally trained to do. That's what they do. And the regulator is a listener, not having to be on the front line fighting the political battle. I don't know if that would be useful, but it might help a little bit. But the other goes to what you said at the end, and both everybody's alluded to, is I don't know to what degree you got to the point is this is very important. These are inputs into trying to get better decisions. But the issue is decisions. and either I want them to protect me on the health-wise, or I want them to cite my thing, and I don't want to take 5 years to get there. And by the way, we don't have a crisis on our hands, folks, and we don't want to wait 5 years to get that transmission line in place. So when do you draw the line? When do you close them out? Or how do you keep them going over here on the side, but making sure nobody believes that we're waiting for a consensus? Because I've never been in a stakeholder process in which everybody finally signed on and went home and said, oh, life is wonderful. Instead, they come back to fight to the end, to the death. Excuse me.
So, very good points. Very good points. When Colorado was considering the methane regulation for oil and gas which was adopted in 2014, the first stakeholder meeting that we had over 100 people there. You just can't. But we start off our stakeholder meetings by all comers. We want to know and everybody that walks in the room is a stakeholder. But some stakeholders are frankly more important than others. Because they have more to gain or to lose in the system. And so I think what we have learned is almost every case is a little different on how you sort of structure the stakeholder process. But eventually what we've done is we will say, this is when the hearing is going to be, or this is when, and so we've got to kind of and if everybody feels that pressure, you have a better chance of people then starting to compromise, as opposed to it's just gonna go until we get a consensus. You'll never get one. So yeah, you very good points. And we have used third-party facilitators at times. It's a resource issue often, but if we're viewed as being as too involved in already making up our mind, so that we're not really the neutral decision maker, we will do that. We will get a third party that comes in. Thanks.
And I just want to give a quick shout out to something that Daniel said earlier about, I don't know if you put it this way, but setting expectations. We were talking about these processes. It's so important to say, here's what we can decide in this process, here's what we can't decide in this process. So not only that deadline, but also here are the parameters. We're not going to sort of...
Never, ever going to have full information you'd like to have.
Correct.
It's always going to be imperfect, and so you've got to close it out.
Yeah, and just quickly to add, so I think what we all have in mind is, decisions continue to get made, but the information, the evidentiary foundation that informs those decisions continues to improve. And so, again, not going to always be perfect decisions, but we just want to try to make it better, maybe incrementally, but make it better. Bill?
And could you introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Bill Hederman, University of Pennsylvania. I was brought into FERC to set up the Market Oversight Investigations Office after Enron, so we didn't have the luxury of getting there before the controversy. But to Phil's point, what we did is held numerous technical conferences, but the staff ran them, and we literally sat in the commissioner's seats and asked the panels the questions. But the commissioners were there and let it be known they were there, but they just got to sit and think, and that worked as an intermediate step that I just thought I'd share.
Hi, my name is Deb. I'm recently retired from the Navy. I was an environmental attorney, so lived all these processes. You say they're the same, whether you're getting regulated because jets are flying over people's heads or it's oil and gas, it's the same. One question for Kate. I have a two-part, if that's okay. Kate, you mentioned something in their hierarchy of risk management. You know, it's all good to explain and undo all this stuff and talk, but you actually have to come to the table with something, because otherwise communities sniff that out pretty fast too. They're like, it's great that you're talking to us, but you're not giving us anything, and they get frustrated with that. So when we have community investment programs or these oil and gas, what do you find actually gets traction with communities, and like what form these programs take? And then a question for Martha. I see you're an environmental attorney as well. And so what I thought about a lot was, where does the rubber meet the road? Like, this is all fine. People can be agitated. I can be more or less concerned about it, but how are they actually going to stop me? What is the cause of action? What form do they take? When do you actually get that injunction? When do they can actually like stop this?
Yeah, I'll start to answer that first question, but I also think a lot of what Daniel has done goes directly to that point. The headlines are often about the environmental risk, about chemical use, about groundwater contamination, about seismic events, and certainly those are concerns shared by communities. But it seems like far and away, when you get communities to really break down what they're concerned about, it's truck traffic, it's too many kids at the schools now, it's man camps and the potential for safety issues and crime activity when a lot of guys get paid all at the same time and they've been working nonstop for several weeks. So it ends up being some of these things that aren't even really necessarily about the oil and gas development itself. And that was one of the things I think that came out through some of our conversations, that there can be an assumption. People come to the table of like, this is what people are going to want to talk about. And then that ends up not being what they want to talk about. They want to talk about the truck traffic. But I do think Daniel might be able to, he's had so much on the road experience interviewing folks in these, and particularly maybe thinking about the community investment and sort of where they're looking for companies to make the investments.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So by way of background, the Sloan Foundation supported some research that I did with my colleague and boss, Richard Newell, at RFF, looking at how local governments and local communities are affected by increased oil and gas development. So I traveled to all of the major shale plays and interviewed something like 250 local government officials to understand what was happening in the different communities. And as Kate says, the first thing, truck traffic, far and away the most important issue. And so how do you address that issue? Well, there's a variety of ways you can. Sometimes companies make sure to route their vehicle traffic so it doesn't interfere with school drop-offs or school pickups. So they're not on the road between 8 and 9 a.m. or something like that. Or they have haul routes that are designated by local governments to avoid sensitive areas. There are also activities where operators repair the roads that they damage from the activities that their drilling or whatever incurs. That doesn't happen in every place, but some places it does happen. We can, if anyone's interested why it doesn't happen in some places and does happen in others, that's actually a really interesting discussion in and of itself. But by and large, when you look broadly across the country, the places where there is a lot of oil and gas development happening, there are negative impacts and there are positive impacts. The economic benefits are typically such that you don't see a lot of banned fracking activity in Midland, Texas, right? So the oil and gas industry doesn't necessarily need to provide a community benefits agreement in many of these communities to demonstrate its positive impacts, because the economic benefits are pretty clear for most people to see. It's really about mitigating the negative impacts, and in particular the externalities that are really important, and where there has been some good work done, and there's also lots of room for improvement.
So your question really quickly on the cause of action, I think in litigation and I think we have a lot of lawyers in the health department. And I think whenever we're making decisions, we do think about are we creating a lawsuit here? And if we are, can we defend it? And mostly, we think about that. But if you're thinking about it in those terms, that's really bad. That means that things have not gone well in the communication effort. It happens occasionally we would get sued, but basically if we do a good enough job in explaining why we're making the decision we're making, and we've done a good enough job getting input early on in the process, I think we've avoided a lot of those lawsuits. But that's where things have broken down. Litigation is always the worst. That means you've done something. Even if you win in litigation, the fact that you're in litigation means that you failed somehow in working with whoever it is that sued you.
Dave Cole, Ohio State University. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is an observation we've made in Ohio in the Appalachian Basin, our part of and Dan, you visited us, I think, last year. Unfortunately, I wasn't at your talk. What we saw coming early on through the Department of Extension on our campus, those are the guys that deal with the ag side of things, they deal with the water side, but they quickly picked up on the notion that they needed to get out into the communities with the ag extension agents and change their conversation to oil and gas. And so this is just, I think it's a quasi-success story in some ways, because they did that pretty well in eastern Ohio. We had a rich history of oil and gas anyway. Standard Oil of Ohio started with Rockefeller, so there's several 100,000 wells in Ohio. So there's already a conversation about that. But the a land-grant institution like Ohio State kind of moved into that space along with their sister land-grant institutions across other states to get that word out, okay? And what they wanted to do is they wanted to be able to present a balanced case between what the environmental impacts are and land impacts and economic impacts versus what is it that fracking really is, because people didn't really understand it, okay? So that's just a comment that it sort of worked. And so, but as Daniel pointed out, it was, and other people pointed out, it was sort of trying to play catch up because the leases were already in play, things were happening, so it was sort of trying to catch up. But it sort of worked. And so one of the things they evolved to was these oil and gas fairs associated with state fairs, where they would have the companies come and have their gatherings and kind of talk about that, mainly about jobs, but just in terms of who they are. The question I have, I think, and I have the wrong language here, commission of practice. I'm not sure if I used the right words. I'm experienced with the National Risk Assessment Program, which is all about CO2 sequestration, putting CO2 in the ground, which is another contentious issue, not in my backyard. But what they did is they tried to develop a platform where we have models that people could apply to these various areas as benchmarking for how well are we doing with risk. Is that what you're thinking with respect to this commission of practice, whatever you call it? Is that where you would want to see that go in terms of a national program that then builds a best practices portfolio?
Well, the community of practice is
Community practice.
is basically the state agencies. It basically is a place where they can share information with each other. So it is sharing best practices, sharing, here's what we do in Colorado, here's what we do in Oklahoma, we had an issue with community X here in this state, here's how we handled it. So it's more a how can we learn from each other kind of a community of practice. It's the academy that then takes it the step further with a curriculum on different skill sets, technical as well as some of the soft skills. But it is a sharing. I don't think it's so much as in the community of practice one of then developing standards as much as it is just sharing what we know and what we're doing.
Could you see the value, though, for something like NRAP for the oil and gas industry, where they build this sort of platform to be able to test and then look at various emerging plays as things come online.
Sure, yeah, yes, yeah.
I think we might be a viable
Yeah.
kind of model
Yeah.
that one might want to think about.
Yeah.
This was DOE funded through NETL, right, in Pittsburgh, but I think it's a possible model that we've been involved with. So, thank you.
Let's go all the way in the back.
Hi, Steve Brock, Symbioscape. I have a question about an important stakeholder that actually shares the landscape with the developers, and that would be farmers and ranchers. And I appreciate the ag question, but I have a question: what is your experience with the farmers and ranchers? Many times, obviously, with the service rights being subservient to the mineral rights, and also, do you see any potential or appetite for oil and gas industry to partner with the people they're sharing the landscape with, or more broadly with a community of ranchers and farmers to assist in their ecosystem services? They're obviously in many ways struggling in rural America in that regard. Would there be any sort of potential for a partnership that would, in the spirit of sustainability of these larger corporations, assist the farmers and ranchers whose land they're on to transition to more beneficial ecosystem services, or even a transition to climate-smart agriculture?
First of all, and sort of since you also piggybacked on the last question and comment, ag extension offices are terrific outreach tools, and I was involved in another project working on best practices for soil management and nutrient management on farms, and that is absolutely a critical piece of that, of having those conversations with trusted partners who are producers. On the ag and rancher part, so Greg had mentioned that some of this work has now been sort of used to think about greenfield production in West Texas, and looking not just at oil and gas production, but energy production writ large, transmission, pipelines, wind, solar, and oil and gas. And so we have, as part of our group, a number of ranchers. And so I'd say from that, just initially, it's going to depend where you are in the United States and whether their estate is intact. So in West Texas, many of these ranches, they own the surface rights and they own the mineral rights. And so many of them already have leases with the oil and gas operators or with wind developers, and so they come to the table already with that interest. Those same ranchers also have deep concerns about the surface impacts, particularly because West Texas is still this, a bunch of them wear these baseball hats of like America's last frontier. I mean, it's like a point of pride. It's beautiful. It's ecologically sensitive. People have a strong tie to it. So there's both that economic desire to make the most of their subsurface mineral estate, but also they're at the table here wanting to have a conversation about how do you do that development in a way that protect some of these values. In places with a split estate, which is I think what you sort of teed up, it's very different. If you're a farmer and have the surface rights, that might help you work with a wind developer, but downhole, it's not your call if somebody wants to develop the mineral estate underneath your farm. And that can, in some states there are surface rights acts, so then you can be compensated for harms to the surface, but in many states we do not have that kind of protection, including Texas. So becomes a very different analysis.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And it actually raises a question for me that I will ask and not answer, which is, the places where we see the most opposition to oil and gas development tends to be cities, suburban areas, places like that. I wonder whether that is because there are more split estates within these, sort of newer subdivisions and, north of Denver or whatever, or if it's simply a reflection of the fact that it's easier to organize people in a city or in a suburban area than it is out in a rural area. So I don't know what the answer to that is. It's a good research question, I think, but I don't know, that's what your question makes me think of.
I think we've got time for about 2 more. Let's go right here and then to Carl.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Rudra. Thank you for your presentation. My question's actually, I'm a researcher, and just to give a bit of context, I worked on the shale gas inquiry at the UK Parliament about 9 years ago. God, I'm aging myself. And my question was, if your work if it's been used or you're planning to take it forward to international context, let's say Canada or Australia, or if you've had any input from practices internationally into the work that you've done. Thank you.
So I've had a little bit of experience with this, not in the UK, but the US State Department and the Department of Interior has a program where they send technical experts around the world to talk with regulators and policymakers who are considering developing shale gas or tight oil resources. And I've participated in a few of those events in Argentina, in Brazil and Colombia. I think there may have been some delegations over to the UK, but I'm not sure. I'm happy to share the contacts who are helping to run that work if it would be helpful. I think some of the lessons of the research that we've reviewed and some of the lessons about stakeholder engagement, regulatory excellence that come out of this dialogue are certainly relevant in other jurisdictions. There's lots of reasons why the U.S. is different from the U.K. and pretty much every other country. The private ownership of mineral rights being by far and away, I think, the most important one, or at least the first one that I think of. But yeah, I think there's definitely applicability here, and there are some efforts that are already going on, and I think it'd be great to expand it further.
And just to answer the question about inputs in the dialogue, we had Canadian regulators and stakeholders involved, some local government regulators as well as state regulators from different provinces involved in our conversation. We also had people who had done research in other countries. So Cindy, I'm thinking of, we had an economist from NYU who's done a lot of work around stakeholder engagement and community opposition to large energy infrastructure projects around the world. Really cool projects, like looking at words and how projects are described over time in newspapers, and then matching that up to the stock price of that company, and sort of seeing as it got more contentious that you could actually correlate that to a drop in value in the companies, and then making that case that meant stakeholder engagement is a good investment. So we did try to take some of those lessons, but as Daniel said, that the private mineral ownership really does make the stakeholder dynamics very different. And yet some of these are universal principles that probably could be applied to every context.
Thank you. My name is Carl Peckman. I'm the director of the National Regulatory Research Institute. We're the research arm of the country's public utility commissions. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about the community of practice, but first let me tell you what we're doing, because I think we have very of the same kinds of issues that environmental regulators are having, rapidly increasing stakeholders, new issues, staff that are retiring, inability to access the literature, which I think is you're talking about they don't have time for the literature. When I was at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we didn't even have a vehicle to access literature. So what we're doing is similar to your idea of the community of practice, is creating a regulatory training initiative, which hopefully will be a web-based training platform that would also become a community where people can discuss issues within public utility regulation. And I'm curious how, or if you have plans on how to unfold your notion of community of practice. Is it going to be within individual trade organizations, or are the environmental regulators trying to address this in a more comprehensive way?
That's an excellent question. I don't know that we know how to roll out the community of practice or the academy. As Daniel said, with the research issues, it's a question of resources, of money, of time, of frankly interest. Getting some entity involved in that as an important endeavor. I do think that looking at some of the existing institutions as a place to maybe not house it, but to at least sort of kickstart it, would, instead of just starting from scratch, you have either ECOS, the IOGCC, as potential places to engage in that conversation because they both have within their sphere their I would argue some a level of a community that talks about things, but again in a more narrow construct. So I think it's an idea that needs some further conversation as to where it goes. I mean that's the problem with I will say with these kind of recommendations is that the fear is you don't want to have the recommendation go up on a shelf and just sort of collect dust. You want it to have some life, and in order for it to have some life, you need to get people to back it and to try to move it forward. And that's not something that I'm aware has really occurred yet, but it is something that I think we do need to pursue.
I just wanted something that you said just as you were framing up your question was the access to academic publications. And I just wanted to put a pin in that was something we definitely had a lot of discussion about the need that researchers need to pay that extra whatever it is and get open access publication and not have their publications locked behind a paywall if they want it to be relevant in real time to policymakers. And we also talked about making data sets publicly available because sometimes researchers take a while to do that because they're hoping they can get more publications out of it. But talking about, we definitely heard that the academics loud and clear from the other stakeholders that it's really important to get this stuff out there. So thanks for making that point.
So I wanted to thank Evan and Sloan Foundation and the Mitchell Foundation again for supporting this effort over the last several years. I wanted to thank each of you for participating and being part of this. And I want to thank everyone for coming out this morning. We'll be around for a few minutes if you have additional questions. Otherwise,